On September 7, 1945, the Allied powers held a victory parade in the ruins of Berlin. Western officers were up on the reviewing stand, watching columns of military hardware roll by, when 52 Soviet tanks crawled past them, and the sight caught everyone off guard. These were machines none of the Western Allies had ever seen before. Heavy IS-3 tanks with flattened hemispherical turrets and angular pike noses. On the outside, the specs looked intimidating. A 122mm main gun, 110mm of sloped armor, and a hull shape designed to deflect incoming rounds. What the Western officers didn't know at the time was that the IS-3 was already plagued with serious problems, cracking weld seams, a painfully cramped fighting compartment, and poor mechanical reliability. But none of that was visible from the reviewing stand. All they saw was a massive, aggressive-looking machine that their current tanks seemed unable to counter. Word spread fast through Western military circles, and the concern was real. One officer later recalled that moment like this. When the IS-3 appeared, everyone was uneasy, wondering what they could do if they had to face it. And on paper, the concern wasn't unfounded. The Mark I Centurion carried a 76mm gun and had just 76mm of armor. Against the IS-3's frontal protection, that gun would have struggled at typical combat ranges. Intelligence reported that the USSR was planning to build more heavy tanks, and Western Command worried about the possibility of these machines pushing through the Fulda Gap toward Western Europe. Whether the Soviets could actually mass-produce them reliably was another question entirely, but the perceived threat was enough. Engineers were ordered to build a tank capable of engaging Soviet heavy armor at long range, where Western fire control and optics could provide a decisive edge. And that's how a project was born that, 10 years later, would become the FV214 Conqueror, the heaviest and most powerful tank the British Army had ever built. Development started with engineers taking the chassis from the A-45 project, an infantry support tank that never got finished before the war ended. Initially, they planned to arm the new machine with an 84mm 20-pounder gun, but by 1949 it became clear that wasn't enough. Intel reports showed that Soviet designers weren't sitting idle, and a radical decision was made to mount a 120mm gun. This was a massive, overpowered weapon, capable of sending an armor-piercing round at 1,433 meters per second and punching through any Soviet armor of that era. While engineers wrestled with building a turret for the new gun, the Army needed something, anything, to test the running gear. That's how the interim version, the FV214 Conqueror, came about. It was the hull of the future Conqueror, but topped with a turret from the Mark III Centurion. They built 21 tanks fitted with the 20-pounder gun. The Conqueror never saw combat. It was used exclusively for testing the chassis and training crews, but it gave the engineers priceless experience. By 1954, the turret with the 120mm gun was finally ready. They mounted it on the refined hull, and the FV214 Conqueror, the Conqueror, was born. The first production machines rolled off the line in 1955, and it was truly an impressive sight. 64 tons of combat weight, armor up to 180mm thick on the turret front, and a main gun capable of hitting targets well beyond the effective range of the IS-3's own weapons. All told, they built 185 Conquerors, 20 of the Mark I and 165 of the Mark II. Production wrapped up in 1959. These tanks were meant to be the last line of defense against Soviet heavy machines, operating behind the main Centurion forces and picking off enemy tanks from a safe distance. When the Conqueror first rolled out of the factory gates, even seasoned tankers stopped in their tracks. This machine looked like it was built not for war, but to intimidate by its sheer appearance. The massive hull, with its distinctive arrangement of 8 small road wheels on each side, mounted in 4 bogies, resembled the famous Churchill. And that was no accident. The Conqueror inherited from it the infantry tank concept, with its emphasis on armor and cross-country ability. The drive sprockets were at the rear, the idler wheels up front, and between them stretched wide tracks that kept this giant from sinking into soft ground. The horseman suspension was one of the key engineering decisions that defined the character of this machine. Each unit consisted of 2 road wheels and 1 return roller, mounted on an external balance bogie. It was brilliantly simple. If the tank hit a mine or took battle damage, the crew could swap out an entire suspension unit right in the field without tearing up the tank's floor. Steel wheels with rubber buffers between each pair reduced the chance of throwing a track on rough terrain, and the width of the tracks themselves gave the Conqueror excellent cross-country mobility for a machine of that weight. The heart of the tank was a Rolls-Royce Meteor M120, a 12-cylinder gasoline engine putting out 810 horsepower. Aviation buffs will immediately recognize a relative of the legendary Merlin, the very same engine that lifted Spitfires and Lancasters into the sky during World War II. Of course, the tank version was detuned and adapted for ground use, but you could feel the thoroughbred genes in every stroke of that motor. The same engine powered the Centurions too, which simplified supply and maintenance in the field. But 810 horsepower for 64 tons, that's frankly not enough. The Conqueror's power-to-weight ratio was just 12.5 horsepower per ton, making it one of the slowest tanks of its era. Top speed on roads reached about 22 miles per hour, but in practice, crews rarely even hit that number. On the other hand, the Conqueror handled rough terrain more confidently than the lighter Centurion. Wide tracks and a powerful suspension let it cross ground where other tanks would hopelessly bog down. The transmission came with a surprise for the crews. Conquerors were fitted with 2 different gearboxes, the Z52 and the Z52R. Both had 5 forward gears and 2 reverse, but the shift patterns were mirror images of each other. The lever position that engaged first gear on one gearbox would engage reverse on the other. A driver switching from one tank to another had to first figure out which transmission was installed. Otherwise, instead of lurching forward, the tank might suddenly jerk backward, with potentially catastrophic consequences for anything behind 64 tons of metal. The Conqueror's main weapon was the L1, a 120mm rifled gun. This weapon was designed specifically to destroy heavily armored targets, and it could fire 2 types of ammunition. The first was an armor-piercing discarding sabot round, which the military simply called APDS. A tungsten core was accelerated in the barrel to 1,433 meters per second, and at a range of nearly 1.25 miles, it could penetrate 120 millimeters of armor set at a 55-degree angle. The sabot, shaped like a pot, guided the round through the barrel, and after exiting, it fell away, leaving a compact and incredibly fast penetrator to fly toward the target. The second type of ammunition was the Hesh round, a high-explosive squash head, a tanker's favorite weapon. The way it worked was diabolically clever. On hitting armor, the plastic explosive squashed flat against the surface, then detonated, sending a shockwave into the metal. On the opposite side of the armor, a deadly scab of metal would break off and ricochet around the enemy tank's fighting compartment, destroying the crew and equipment. The advantage of Hesh was that its effectiveness didn't depend on the speed of impact. The round was equally lethal at any range. The effective firing range for this ammunition reached about 1,600 yards, compared to around 1,100 for the armor-piercing round. The Conqueror carried 35 rounds of 2-piece ammunition. The projectiles and cartridge cases with propellant charges were stored separately, which made the loader's job harder but reduced the risk of an ammo cook-off if the tank was hit. Some of the ammunition was kept in the turret for quick access. The rest was stored in the hull. 25 cartridge cases with propellant sat in a compartment to the left of the driver. The Conqueror's turret was a complex cast structure unlike anything built before. The wide, curved front section flowed smoothly into a massive rear bustle, where part of the ammunition and equipment were stored. But the most unusual feature was the small commander's cupola perched on top of the main turret, like a separate little fortress. And it was this cupola that concealed the Conqueror's main technological ace, a fire control system that was decades ahead of its time. The engineers were the first in the world to design and implement on a production tank a system that would later be called Hunter-Killer. The whole idea was to split the workload between the commander and the gunner in a way nobody had done before. The commander's cupola had an electric drive and could rotate a full 360 degrees, independently of the main turret. Inside it, the commander had his own periscope for scanning the terrain, an optical rangefinder, and a sight with 6 power magnification for aiming the main gun and the coaxial machine gun. To the right of the sight was a handle for rotating the cupola, and a special azimuth indicator that showed where the main gun was aimed at any given moment. The system worked like this. The commander would spot a target, measure the range with the rangefinder, and pass the data to the gunner, while simultaneously slewing the turret in the right direction. The gunner would make the fine adjustments and open fire. But while the gunner was dealing with the first target, the commander wasn't wasting time. He would swing his cupola around, searching for the next threat, measuring range, and preparing data for the next shot. The moment the gunner finished with the first target, the commander would instantly hand off the coordinates of the second, and the cycle repeated. This cut the time between shots at different targets dramatically. What's more, the commander could take over fire control entirely. His sight and controls allowed him to independently aim and fire the main gun or the 7.62 mm machine gun mounted on the cupola ring. The machine gun was belt-fed with belts of 200 or 250 rounds, and 2 spare belts were stored inside the turret. This setup gave the crew a level of tactical flexibility that no other tank of that era could match. The Conqueror became the first British tank equipped with an optical rangefinder. Before this, tankers estimated range by eye, or by the method of ranging shots, burning through precious ammunition and time. Now the commander could get an exact distance with a single press of a button and pass it to the gunner, who'd dial in the correction and hit the mark with the very first shot. At ranges beyond half a mile, this gave a colossal advantage. Where the IS-3 crew was still trying to figure out the distance and walk in their fire, the Conqueror was already sending a lethal tungsten dart downrange. But the revolutionary system had a downside. The commander ended up literally walled off inside his cupola, cut off from the rest of the crew. One tank commander later recalled, "In the Centurion, the crew was like a family, but in the Conqueror, you climbed into this thing on top. The loader was somewhere down below, the gunner was over there somewhere, and the driver was God knows where." A lot of people didn't like that, because you were isolated. You couldn't lean over and talk to the gunner or the operator, you just sat up there on your own. All communication with the crew happened exclusively through the tank intercom, and if it broke down, the commander turned into a deaf-mute observer. Even worse was the situation with the cupola's electric drive. It regularly failed, and the designers hadn't provided a manual backup. When the electrics went out, the cupola simply froze in place, and the commander lost the ability to rotate it in search of targets. One tanker put it simply, "If the electrics broke, and that happened a lot, that was it. You were stuck." Now for the big question that kept both generals and tankers awake at night. Who would have won in a duel between the Conqueror and the IS-3? On paper, the Western tank had the advantage in range finding and rate of fire, and its 120 mm gun could confidently punch through Soviet armor at combat ranges. But experienced tankers, when asked this question, were cautious in their assessments. The problem was that the IS-3 had a very low profile, which in theory made it harder to spot in a defensive position. Some believed it could have ambushed a Centurion or two before being engaged. But others pointed out that the IS-3's painfully slow rate of fire, limited crew visibility, and chronic mechanical breakdowns would have been just as much of a factor in any real engagement. In the end, they never had to put that to the test. so it all remained just speculation. The tankers themselves admitted that the Conqueror left them with mixed feelings. The general impression was that it was just too complicated, not simple, like the good old Centurion. A lot of people flat out didn't like it. If the Conqueror's commander suffered from isolation in his cupola, the loader endured torment of a completely different kind. His job was probably the most physically demanding of any tank crew specialty at the time. Separate loading meant that every shot required two motions. First, shove in a projectile weighing up to about 35 pounds, then send a brass cartridge case with the propellant charge, weighing up to around 50 pounds, into the breech, close to 90 pounds for every single shot. And all of this in a cramped fighting compartment, under the thunder of gunfire and the clang of machinery. The 35 rounds of ammunition were spread throughout the vehicle. Some were stored in racks around the turret for quick access. The loader could reach those fairly easily. But when those ran out, he'd have to stretch for the rounds stored in the hull, and that meant acrobatic feats inside a tank that was rocking and swaying on the move. 25 cartridge cases with propellant charges sat in a compartment to the left of the driver, and getting to them took a real effort. But the loader's true curse was a mechanism that, by design, was supposed to make his life easier: the automatic spent case ejector. The story of its creation would be funny if it weren't true. The War Office contracted the development of this device to a company called Mullins, which specialized in making cigarette dispensing machines. Yes, those very machines where you drop in a coin and get a pack of cigarettes. Apparently, someone at the ministry decided that a cigarette dispensing mechanism and a mechanism for ejecting red-hot brass cartridge cases were basically the same thing. The Mullins system sat behind the gun breech and was a bulky, awkward contraption with a perspex screen to protect against bouncing cases. Here is how it was supposed to work. After firing, the red-hot case would drop onto a special tray and press a micro switch that activated the ejection mechanism. The case was then supposed to automatically fly out through a special hatch in the side of the turret. Sounds simple and elegant, but in practice this device turned the crew's life into a nightmare. The case constantly slipped off the guide rails and fell anywhere but where it was supposed to go. Sometimes it would jam between the breech and the turret roof, completely locking up the gun. Sometimes the mechanism would just stop halfway, leaving the ejection hatch wide open. And an open hatch in the side of the turret during combat is a standing invitation for any enemy infantryman with a grenade. Tossing a grenade through a gap like that wouldn't have been hard even for a raw recruit. There was a manual override for emergencies, but using it took a full 5 minutes, an eternity in a tank battle. Tankers described this system with barely concealed frustration. The gun fires, and this huge red-hot case drops to the bottom. What's the loader supposed to do with it? He's got to try to pick it up and toss it out through the hatch, which means the hatch has to be open. Or there's this little handle that you have to crank for what feels like forever to open the port and get the case out. When the system worked, great, but it hardly ever did. The driver's station was in the front of the hull, on the right side. In front of him were 2 steering levers for the steering brakes, and between his legs stuck up the gear shift lever. The pedals were laid out in the classic arrangement: clutch on the left, brake in the middle, gas on the right. The instrument panel had gauges for temperature, fuel, and speed, switches for the batteries and generator, and a turret position indicator so the driver knew where the gun was pointing. The seat was height adjustable, allowing the driver to operate with the hatch open and his head sticking out, or buttoned up, watching the road through periscopes. The Mark I Conqueror had 3 viewing periscopes. On the Mark II, these were replaced with a single but more advanced unit. The Mark II also featured a redesigned fume extractor on the gun barrel and straight-through exhaust pipes instead of the mufflers on the first version. Tankers recalled driving the Conqueror with a certain fondness. Fuel-injected engine, around 800 horsepower, and it drove pretty well. The driving was excellent, though with double clutching and other quirks. But if you were driving a Conqueror, everyone got out of your way, Behind the wheel it was all right. Noisy, of course, and with those steel tracks on pavement the racket was horrendous, but mechanically everything worked fine. Though the maintenance guys would probably have a different opinion. And the maintenance guys did indeed have a different opinion. The Conqueror was plagued by reliability problems. The tank just didn't have enough power for its weight, and maintenance crews ran themselves ragged trying to keep these things running. The recovery vehicles built on the same chassis did all right, but the combat tanks carrying the extra weight of the turret and gun constantly stalled and refused to start. No amount of tinkering could fix the problem for good. Conquerors were sent to units stationed in West Germany, right at the tip of the spear if the Soviets ever decided to attack. They were parceled out across tank regiments, just a handful per unit, and their tactical role was strictly defined. Conquerors were to take up positions at a tactical distance behind the main Centurion forces and operate as snipers, picking off Soviet heavy tanks from ranges beyond the reach of return fire. The concept looked great on paper, but reality turned out to be a whole lot messier. Every training exercise became a battle for the crews, not so much against the simulated enemy as against their own machine. The 64-ton giant was as temperamental as a spoiled thoroughbred horse. The engine would stall at the worst possible moment, refusing to start in the cold or after a long march. The electrics in the commander's cupola failed with depressing regularity, stripping the commander of his main advantage, the ability to independently search for targets. The spent case ejector jammed every other time, and loaders cursed under their breath as they manually shoved the red-hot brass out through the emergency hatch. Maintenance crews worked themselves to the bone. They learned to fix Conquerors practically with their bare hands, swapping horsemen, suspension units in the field, troubleshooting the finicky electrics, and tuning the perpetually maladjusted engine. These tanks chewed through spare parts at a staggering rate. Every Conqueror that was actually running on the line meant dozens of man-hours from the mechanics and mountains of spare parts. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, something unexpected was happening. The USSR never launched the mass production of heavy tanks that the West had feared so much. The IS-3, which had looked so intimidating at the Berlin parade, turned out to be far less formidable than its appearance suggested. The hull welds cracked under stress. The fighting compartment was so cramped that the crew could barely operate. The rate of fire was dismal, and the mechanical reliability was poor enough that many vehicles spent more time in repair shops than on the field. The Soviets themselves recognized the design was deeply flawed, and most IS-3s were eventually pulled from frontline service and relegated to reserve or fortified positions. Soviet military thinkers had come to the same conclusion as their Western counterparts. The future belonged not to heavy tanks, but to universal fighting vehicles that combined mobility, protection, and firepower in a sensible balance. While the Conquerors were rusting on training grounds, engineers weren't sitting idle. The Centurion was progressively upgraded, receiving increasingly powerful armament. First, the 76mm gun was replaced with the 84mm 20-pounder, and then they mounted the famous L7, 105mm rifled gun. That gun turned out to be one of the best tank weapons ever made and spread across the entire Western world. It was fitted to American, German, and Israeli tanks. With that weapon, the Centurion could confidently take on any Soviet armor at real combat distances. And just like that, there was no real reason to keep the big, clumsy, temperamental Conqueror around anymore. In the early 60s, the High Command made the decision about the fate of the heavy tanks. They were expensive to run, a nightmare to maintain, and needed their own separate logistics chain. The Conquerors just didn't fit the concept of a modern army anymore. All 185 Conquerors that were built served only 11 years, from 1955 to 1966. They were replaced by the Chieftain, a new main battle tank built from the ground up as a do-it-all machine that could handle any mission on the battlefield. The chieftain inherited the Conqueror's 120mm main gun caliber and refined fire control system, but shed the excessive weight and the problems that came with it. The hunter-killer principle, first implemented on the Conqueror, became the standard for every subsequent generation of main battle tanks around the world. The optical rangefinder, which seemed like a technological marvel in the 50s, gave way to laser systems. But the core idea, precisely determining the range to a target before pulling the trigger, never went away. Most of the decommissioned Conquerors ended their days on firing ranges as targets or became monuments at the gates of military bases. A few made it into museums and private collections, where they sit rusting in the open air, quiet reminders of the brief era of Cold War heavy tanks. One veteran even served as a home for a stray cat named Stanley, who lived for over 16 years inside the rusted-out hull of a Conqueror standing guard at the gates of Stanley Barracks near Bovington. The Conqueror never met its main rival, the Soviet IS-3, in combat. The Cold War, thankfully, stayed cold, and the question of who would have won that showdown will forever be debated by historians and armor enthusiasts alike. The era of heavy tanks, when designers tried to beat the enemy with ever thicker armor and ever bigger guns, came to an end. The concept of the universal main battle tank won out, and the Conqueror was left as a monument to a bygone era, a time when the appearance of an unfamiliar Soviet tank at a Berlin parade set off a chain reaction that led Western engineers to build their own 64-ton giant, only to discover that the threat they were responding to was never quite as overwhelming as it first seemed.